Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Russia has found a new way to promote its so-called family values. And, surprise, surprise, it involves dubstep, smoke machines, and a not-so-suspicious lack of rainbow flags. Welcome to Intervision, Moscow's answer to Eurovision. Same spectacle, same glitter, but with a distinctly Putin-approved twist. And while Vietnam's artists walked away with the trophy, the real prize for Russia was proving it can host a global party without letting politics in, except, of course, for all the politics that slipped through anyway. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Time to announce the winner of the Intervision Song Contest!
Russia has brought back the Intervision Song Contest, a Cold War-era event once seen as the socialist world's answer to Eurovision. The contest made its official return in Moscow, where Vietnam's Duke Phuc took home the top prize, earning a 30 million ruble award, about $360,000. Intervision originally ran in the 1960s and 70s before fading away with the rise of Western pop culture and the collapse of the Soviet Union. This year's revival comes after Russia's exclusion from Eurovision in 2022. Vladimir Putin signed a decree in January, making Intervision a permanent, state-backed alternative. The 2025 debut featured 23 delegations. Russia's own entry, Yaroslav Dronov, known widely as Shaman, performed but declined to compete, calling it unfair for the host to win. The contest wasn't without controversy. US singer was excluded, with organizers citing pressure from Australian authorities over her dual citizenship. President Putin addressed the event by video, while Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced Saudi Arabia will host the 2026 edition.
And now, let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. Russia and Belarus, once prominent contenders in the Eurovision Song Contest, remain excluded from the event. Why is that so? Well, let's take a look.
Russia and Belarus, once prominent contenders in the Eurovision Song Contest, remain excluded from the event. Belarus, which joined Eurovision in 2004, was banned in 2021 after submitting entries containing pro-regime propaganda. The move followed harsh crackdowns on protesters after the disputed 2020 elections. The European Broadcasting Union, which organizes Eurovision, suspended Belarus's state broadcaster, effectively barring the country from future participation. Russia, a Eurovision powerhouse with a notable win in 2008, was excluded in 2022 following its invasion of Ukraine. The EBU cited concerns over the contest's reputation and its commitment to democratic values. Both countries later withdrew from the EBU, solidifying their absence from the competition.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Intervision. The name alone feels like a Soviet relic found in a dusty warehouse. But here it is, relaunched in Moscow with cheering crowds, glowing lights and a clear mission. Give Russia the global song contest it lost when it was booted out of Eurovision for, launching a brutal invasion of Ukraine. So, what does Intervision look like in 2025? Well, 23 acts from countries across the world, from Brazil to China, from Tajikistan to Cuba, all performing on one stage. Eurovision's flamboyant celebration of diversity has been swapped for Russia's stage-managed version of tradition. In other words, glitter is allowed, but rainbows are not. The real story here isn't the music, it's the politics, or rather Russia's strenuous efforts to convince us there were none. Take, for example, the mysterious disappearance of America's contestant, electronic artist Vassi, a dual US-Australian citizen. Organizers claimed her last-minute withdrawal was due to unprecedented political pressure from Australia's government. Yet Intervision's officials insisted the US was still fully represented. How? By sticking Joe Lynn Turner, the former Deep Purple frontman, on the jury. Meanwhile, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov turned up, reassuring everyone that this was definitely not about politics. But the bigger point is that Intervision is not new. It's a revival of a Soviet contest that ran between 1965 and 1980, designed as a direct competitor to Eurovision. Back then, it was a tool of Soviet soft power. Today, it is Putin's attempt at the same, creating a cultural showcase to prove Russia can still lead a global stage. Look at the participant list: Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Cuba, Venezuela, China. These are not exactly bastions of liberal democracy. Instead, they are countries either economically tied to Russia or politically sympathetic. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has already signed on to host next year's contest. But beyond the spectacle, Intervision exposes a contradiction. On the one hand, Moscow insists this is a contest free from politics. On the other hand, its entire existence is political. It was created because Russia was expelled from Eurovision after invading Ukraine. Its rules ban LGBTQ+ symbols that have long been part of Eurovision's culture, and its rhetoric, endlessly repeating family values, is straight from the Kremlin's ideological playbook. Let's be clear, music contests are never just about the music. Eurovision itself is famous for block voting, for political snubs, for countries sending cheeky messages in their songs. But Intervision takes that dynamic and strips away the playful camp. For Russia, it is a win-win kind of situation. Domestically, Intervision plays as a proud, defiant gesture. We don't need Europe. We can make our own contest. Internationally, it signals to friendly states that Moscow is still a cultural hub. But here's the catch. Cultural soft power only works if the rest of the world actually wants to tune in. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Dean Vuletic, Eurovision historian. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you very much for having me.
So before we get into the political side of Intervision, in your view, is it a worthy competitor from from an artistic perspective to Eurovision as it stands today?
Well, the production of Intervision certainly did look a lot like Eurovision. It was an impressive television production, the staging, the effects, the props. So yes, in that sense, it is, I think, a serious rival. However, when we look at the content of the contest, then we're talking about very different things. Intervision was set up to promote traditional and family values. We, for example, saw none of the sexual provocation that we see in Eurovision. We saw no queer acts in Intervision. Intervision was also rather humorless, I have to say. Eurovision is renowned for being funny, for the self-mockery that host countries sometimes do when they stage interval acts. So a lot of this was missing from Intervision to make it a serious competitor to Eurovision.
So now, looking at the broader context, would you say that Russia did score a bit of a victory here because it has managed to gather many countries from the global south, and that's a sizable part of the global population? One could actually risk saying that if it goes on like that, if it continues to be successful, it could actually have a bigger audience than Eurovision itself. Would you say that this is a fair assumption? To what extent also is Eurovision actually popular beyond Europe itself? So people in countries which cannot participate or vote are actually still watching it.
Well, indeed, Intervision had more of a global focus. This also made it very different to the Intervision Song Contest that was staged during the Cold War and upon which this Intervision is supposedly modeled. But that Intervision during the Cold War had a core number of Eastern European countries participating. This one had more of a global reach. There are some big countries in Intervision this year: India, China, South Africa, Brazil, for example. But still, when it comes to it, Eurovision has more of a European and global reach. Eurovision is the biggest cultural event in Europe. It attracts some 160 million viewers each year, and increasingly these include more and more viewers from around the world. I was watching Intervision on YouTube, and I can say that the number of viewers on YouTube never was greater than between 8 and 9,000 viewers. 8 and 9,000. When we're watching Eurovision on YouTube, we see millions of viewers following the contest. So we have to see what the official viewing figures for Intervision will be, but going by the YouTube count, I doubt they're going to be higher than those for Eurovision.
Well, it certainly doesn't help that in many of the participating countries, YouTube is actually restricted or blocked now, does it?
Well, no, exactly. And so that really limits the number of platforms that viewers can watch it on. There were some other platforms that were available for people to watch Intervision on, such as Russia's Channel 1. But it also depends on the country that they were in, whether their country was participating in Eurovision and it's one of its national broadcasters was, participating in Intervision, and whether one of its national broadcasters was broadcasting Intervision.
Now, let's talk about values. Do you think situations like this could be a bit of a problem for the West? Because back in the Cold War era, there was a clear dominance of Western culture. Ordinary Russians, for example, were longing to participate and consume Western culture because there was really not that much of a competition domestically. There was still a major difference in terms of quality, popularity, and so on. Do you think this is still the case today? Or is it less likely for the West to be able to still, to use this sort of cultural influence in the same way that it did back during the 1970s or the 1980s?
Well, it's interesting. I think the world was also multipolar during the Cold War. This is something that people often don't understand. They see the West as having dominated popular culture during the Cold War. But I think when we go back to the Cold War and look at the Intervision Song Contest, which was actually led by Czechoslovakia in the 1960s and then Poland in the 1970s, this was at a time when these countries were the most open to Western cultural influences, and even within the Eastern Bloc, they were considered as being, let's say, the most culturally liberal states of the Eastern Bloc at the time when they hosted Intervision. So the world has always been multipolar when it comes to cultural influences, when it comes to cultural power. And these days we also see that. We also see that countries like South Korea, India, and China are important players when it comes to international cultural influences. The West, of course, still holds an important role and continues to fascinate the rest of the world. But I don't think that we should exaggerate the influence of the West. The West still represents certain values when it comes to liberal democracy and human rights. And of course, this is something that we also see reflected in an event like Eurovision.
So now the Russian contender for Intervision, Shaman, who is basically a government-approved kind of cultural figure, he actually decided not to participate in the contest itself, saying that it would be unfair for the host to actually grab the prize. But this actually shows Russia's determination to show that, its artists are all very much in support of government policies. But this actually ignores some recent events. For example, that interview by, the Soviet-era superstar Alla Pugacheva, that actually gathered millions of views on YouTube, even though YouTube is actually restricted in Russia itself. Do you think this might actually create something, how shall I put that, of a dual voice, that you do have the artists who are following the government line, but there is also a substantial number of people, even in the world of arts, who definitely do not agree with what the Kremlin is doing nowadays, except of course on events such as Intervision. They are not going to be included at all.
Exactly. Those voices are not going to be heard, and they also include artists which have performed for Russia in Eurovision in the past. When it comes to Intervision, this year only allowed those artistic voices in Russia that support Putin to appear on stage. Shaman, as you mentioned, sang his song and then gave a speech, a very nationalistic speech, in which he also called on the juries not to vote for him because he said that Russia had won already, as it always does, this time by managing to bring so many countries to Intervision. And then he declared, Ya Ruski, I'm Russian, which is the title of a famous patriotic song of his. So, of course, Intervision was just a stage for the pro-Putin voices in Russia's cultural circles, and the critics of the Russian government have been marginalized in Russian society. And like I said, they include former stars who have, or stars who have formerly performed for Russia in Eurovision.
So Russia is saying that Intervision is pretty much its own invention, and that, you know, it is very much Russian heritage that they are referring to with this contest. But was it always so?
No, it wasn't. Actually, the origins of Intervision go back to the 1960s. This was an initiative of Czechoslovak television in a period when relations between East and West during the Cold War were improving following the death of Stalin. So Czechoslovak television had this idea of staging the Intervision Song Contest as a way to bring together East and West. Eastern European countries were still the core of the contest, but they invited Western interval acts, often Eurovision winners, the Western media, Western record companies. And then this was something that was continued by Polish television from 1977 to 1980 as part of the festival in Sopot. And Polish television even introduced an innovation by bringing a parallel contest which brought together acts representing record companies from around the world. So when it comes to the Cold War, it certainly wasn't a Russian or Soviet invention. It was something that was led by Czechoslovakia and Poland. So really, when the Russians now say they're reviving Intervision, they're actually not reviving the Intervision, the idea of Intervision as it was during the Cold War era.
But looking at artists then, I mean, would you say that perhaps looking at the artists who participated in Eurovision in the past, Russian artists, would you say that they, back then, were more prepared to speak out against things they didn't like? Would you say that the government has really managed to kind of reduce the already limited amount of freedom of speech in the Russian art world to an even smaller degree? That right now you simply cannot have any dissenters, basically, you know, being present in the public sphere.
I mean, I think that's the case in having looked at the biographies of Eurovision artists from Russia. You know, you can see that those who dared to voice dissent following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 were indeed marginalized, and those who supported Putin have seen their careers continue. And this we saw, for example, in Intervision with Polina Gagarina, who sang for Russia in 2015 when Eurovision was staged in Vienna. She sang the song A Million Voices and she came second in that year. And she has actually been subjected to sanctions from the European Union because of her support for the Putin government. So she's not allowed to perform in the European Union as things stand.
So nowadays, many of Russian artists, even those living abroad, they often criticize the war in very vague terms, as a result saying they are against all wars, not even referring to the conflict in Ukraine. Dean Vuletic was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for being here with us and for explaining all these interactions between politics and art, which continue into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Independent Russian media have confirmed the deaths of more than 15,000 mobilized Russian soldiers in Ukraine. The investigation also suggests the real number of casualties may be much higher.
Mediazona and the BBC's Russian service have identified over 15,000 Russian civilians killed after being drafted into the war in Ukraine. Nearly half of those deaths occurred within the first year of Putin's partial mobilization, announced in September 2022. In 2025 alone, at least 1,200 mobilized troops have died. The average age of the dead was 35. Families supposedly say many were forced to sign contracts under threat of being sent to high-risk assault units. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, over 130,000 Russian military deaths have been verified using open sources. Despite the Kremlin declaring mobilization complete, no official decree ended it. Ukraine's military, meanwhile, estimates Russian losses are far higher, at over 1.1 million killed or wounded.
Volodymyr Zelensky is calling for a full technology embargo on Russia after investigators found many foreign-made components in missiles and drones launched this week. He says that only tough, coordinated sanctions can stop the flow of Western tech into Russian weapons.
Ukraine is under near-daily air attacks. Just this past week, Russia launched over 1,500 drones, 1,280 guided bombs and 50 missiles at the country. President Zelensky revealed that investigators found more than 130,000 foreign-made components in the air attack assets. He warned that if Russia isn't stopped, the threat will spread beyond Ukraine, to Europe and the Pacific. Zelensky urged a full tech blockade, sealing supply routes, punishing sanction evasion, and pressuring companies and countries that enable Russia's arms production. He called on the EU to make its 19th sanctions package truly painful, and asked the US to join in.
3 crashed drones have been discovered in 2 regions of Poland. Police secured the sites and notified the military and prosecutors, but the origin of the drones remains unclear.
Mushroom picking is a very popular activity in the fall in Poland, but this year some foragers came across a rather unexpected find. 2 drone wrecks were discovered in the Mazovian province in central eastern Poland, both in remote forests. A third was found in the Lublin region, which borders Belarus. All the sites were secured by the police, with military and prosecutors called in. These incidents follow a series of Russian drone and missile incursions into Polish airspace this month. Authorities have not confirmed if the latest wrecks are linked to earlier Russian drone activity, including an incursion of a large group of UAVs earlier this month, the first such incident ever.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.